The day Peter Hawkins rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, he was carrying three things: a worn leather saddlebag, a reputation for fixing problems other men refused to touch, and a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the road. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that bore the particular roughness of a man who had spent his entire adult life being useful to other people. His face was weathered but not unkind, creased along the jaw and at the corners of his dark eyes in ways that suggested he had squinted into too many sunsets and smiled not nearly enough. He rode a bay gelding named Chester, who was as steady and unadorned as his owner, and he entered Caldwell the same way he entered every town, quietly, without announcement, scanning the street with the measured attention of a man who expected trouble to be waiting for him somewhere, and had learned long ago that worrying about it did not make it arrive any slower. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a cattle town on the edge of becoming something more complicated than a cattle town. The Kishom Trail ran through it like a spine, and the drovers who came up from Texas brought with them money and thirst, and the particular lawlessness of men who had spent 3 months sleeping on hard ground under a sky that belonged to nobody. The town had a marshal named Greer who was competent enough but stretched thin, a general store, a livery, a doctor whose hands shook before noon, a hotel that charged too much for rooms that were too small, and 3 saloons, each of which believed itself to be the most respectable of the 3. Peter had passed through before twice, and both times someone had hired him to handle something the regular law could not or would not manage. He was what people in that part of the country called a troubleshooter, though that word flattened the reality of what he did. He had been a lawman in his 20s, a cattle detective for a large outfit in his 30s, and in the last several years he had settled into the ambiguous middle ground between legal authority and practical necessity. Ranchers hired him to find stolen stock. Merchants hired him to discourage certain types of attention. Small towns hired him to manage problems that required someone who was not politically entangled in the local machinery. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. And he had discovered somewhere around his 41st birthday that being good at something and finding meaning in it were entirely separate propositions. He had no wife. He had never had a wife, which was unusual enough for a man his age that people occasionally made note of it. He had come close once, 20 years ago, a woman in Abilene named Catherine who had wanted a man who would stay in one place, and when he could not promise her that, she had found someone who would. He had not blamed her then, and he did not blame her now. He was not the kind of man women wanted beside them at the breakfast table for 50 years. He was the kind of man they sent for when the alternative was worse. He settled Chester at the livery, paid for 3 days in advance because that was usually enough, and made his way to the hotel to collect the room he had arranged by telegram 2 weeks prior. The man who had hired him this time was a ranch owner named Aldous Brightwell who ran a spread 15 miles south of town and had been losing cattle to rustlers with enough regularity to constitute a crisis. Peter had taken the job because it was February when the telegram arrived, and February was cold, and the work in February was always thin. He collected his key from the hotel clerk, a boy of perhaps 17 who looked at his gun belt with a combination of admiration and terror that Peter had long since stopped noticing, and climbed to the 2nd floor. His room was small, as expected. It faced the main street, which he preferred, and the window was clean enough to see through, which he also preferred. He set his saddlebag on the narrow bed, hung his hat on the hook behind the door, and stood at the window for a long moment looking down at Caldwell's Main Street in the morning light. Directly across the street was a building that had not been there 2 years ago when he had last passed through. It was a clean white clapboard structure, freshly painted, with a sign above the door that read Covington's Dry Goods and Sundries in careful, even lettering. The display window showed bolts of fabric, tins of provisions, and an arrangement of household goods that someone had taken genuine care with. It was a well-tended establishment, the kind that suggested its owner had standards and intended to maintain them. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it, and moved on to what he was actually here to accomplish. He did not think about it again until that afternoon, when he crossed the street to buy a box of ammunition, and discovered, upon entering, that Covington's dry goods was run by a woman. She was behind the counter when he came in, writing in a ledger with the focused efficiency of someone who had a great deal to record and a finite amount of time in which to record it. She did not look up immediately when the bell above the door announced his arrival, which he found immediately interesting, because most storekeepers looked up immediately. When she did look up, he estimated she was in her mid to late 30s, though she carried herself with the kind of self-possession that made estimating a woman's age feel like the wrong exercise entirely. She had dark brown hair pulled back from a face that was sharp-featured and handsome rather than conventionally pretty, with a directness in her gray eyes that was the first thing he registered, and the thing he found himself unable to entirely dismiss afterward. "Be with you in a moment," she said, and returned to her ledger without apology, and finished what she was writing before she set the pen down and gave him her full attention. "What can I get for you?" she asked. He told her what he needed. She retrieved it from the shelf behind her with the ease of long familiarity, named a fair price, and while he counted out the coins he looked around the store with professional habit. "You run this alone?" he asked. She did not seem offended by the question, which itself told him something. She considered it the way a person considers a question they have already answered many times. "I have a boy who helps with deliveries Thursday and Saturday," she said. "Otherwise, yes." "Nora Covington?" he asked, reading the name from the sign as he had filed it from the window. "That's me," she said, and extended her hand across the counter. He took it. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike. "Peter Hawkins," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Aldous Brightwell mentioned he was expecting you." "You know Brightwell. He has an account here," she said. "Half the ranchers within 20 miles do. I extend credit and I keep my inventory current. It makes good sense for both sides. There was no boasting in this. It was simply the accurate report of a practical arrangement." He paid for his ammunition, and she counted back his change to the penny, and he went back out into the afternoon thinking that Caldwell apparently had at least one person in it who was thoroughly capable of managing their own affairs. He spent the first week working Brightwell's rustler problem, which involved riding the southern pastures, speaking to neighboring ranch hands, and spending 2 cold nights camped near a dry creek bed where he had identified the most likely pattern of movement. He was methodical. He had always been methodical. By the end of the week, he had enough to present to Marshal Greer, who was grateful in the way that men are grateful when someone else has done the difficult part of their job for them. And 3 days later, 2 men were in the Caldwell jail awaiting the circuit judge. Brightwell paid him in cash, which Peter preferred, and offered him a room at the ranch if he wanted to stay on for the spring in case additional problems arose, which Peter politely declined. He extended his room at the hotel by another 2 weeks without being entirely certain why. He told himself it was because the weather was improving and the riding would be easier once the mud dried. He told himself it was because he had heard from a rancher south of town that there might be another job available. He told himself various practical and reasonable things, and he went into Covington's dry goods on Tuesday morning to buy coffee and lamp oil. And he stayed for 45 minutes because Nora Covington was in the middle of arguing with a supplier's representative, who was trying to charge her 30 cents a bolt more than the price she had been quoted in writing. And the argument was so crisply and effectively conducted that Peter found himself leaning against the door frame and watching the way a person watches something impressive happening. The representative left without the additional 30 cents per bolt. Nora watched him go with the focused calm of a woman who had never once doubted the outcome, then turned to Peter with a half-smile that suggested she was aware she had had an audience. "You could have left when things got complicated," she said. "It was not complicated," he said. "You had a written quote." "Yes," she agreed. "I did." She moved behind the counter to begin wrapping his order. "He tries it every 3 months or so. New man from the same company. They send someone different each time, hoping a new face will be more persuasive. Has it ever worked?" "No," she said simply, and he believed her. He paid for his items and then, without fully planning to, he said, "Do you take lunch at any particular time?" She looked at him with a steadiness that was not unfriendly but was entirely clear. "I eat lunch at the counter most days," she said. "I do not close the shop." "That was not actually a luncheon invitation," he said, which was not quite true. "I was going to offer to bring something back from the hotel dining room. As a neighbor." She considered him for a moment. The gray eyes were not cold, he had decided. They were careful. There was a difference. "That would be acceptable," she said. "I take my lunch around noon. I have a preference for things that are not boiled past recognition." "I will keep that in mind," he said. He brought lunch at noon, 2 plates carried over from the hotel wrapped in cloth napkins, and they ate at the counter while the store was momentarily empty, and they talked. He asked about the business. She asked about the Brightwell situation in terms that made clear she had already formed her own assessment and was curious whether his matched it. It did, mostly. She had 2 or 3 observations that he found sharp enough to revise a minor detail in his own thinking, and he told her so, and she received the acknowledgement without false modesty and without obvious pleasure, which he found more interesting than either of those other responses would have been. She did not ask him personal questions, and she did not offer personal information, and neither did he, and the meal was over in 35 minutes, and he collected the plates and the napkins and thanked her, and she thanked him, and he walked back across the street to the hotel feeling more awake than he had felt in some time. He brought lunch again on Thursday. They talked longer this time. The store had a quiet afternoon and nobody came in, and they sat at the counter on opposite stools, and the conversation moved from local cattlemen politics to the question of whether Caldwell's population would stabilize now that Dodge City had taken more of the trail traffic, and from there to the more general question of what made a place worth staying in versus passing through. "You have been to a great many places," she said. It was not a question. "I have," he said. "And what brings you back to any particular one? Professionally, I mean." "Work," he said, and then, because that felt incomplete in a way he was not accustomed to acknowledging, he added, "And sometimes the work finishes and there is still something that seems worth waiting on." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, looking at it rather than at him. "That is a careful way of saying something." "It is," he agreed. She looked up then. "I was married," she said. "My husband died 4 years ago, fever. He was a good man and I miss his company occasionally, but I will be honest with you, Mr. Hawkins, because I find dishonesty wastes everyone's time. I have built this store from almost nothing. I own it outright. I handle my own accounts, my own inventory, and my own decisions. I'm not looking for anyone to rescue me from anything, and I'm not looking for anyone to provide for me what I can provide for myself." She paused. "I say this not to be harsh, but because I have had men in this town make certain assumptions, and I prefer to address assumptions directly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand. For what it's worth, I did not come in here with assumptions. I came in here because it is the most intelligently run business in Caldwell, and I find the conversation unusually worthwhile." She studied him. "You mean that?" "I do not say things I do not mean," he said. "It's inefficient." Something shifted in her expression, a very small relaxation around the eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Then you may bring lunch again next Tuesday," she said, "if you are still in town." He was still in town. He was still in town the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. He found himself, over the course of those lunches, learning things about Nora Covington in the way you learn a landscape by walking it slowly rather than riding through it at speed. She had come to Caldwell from Missouri, where she had grown up in a family that ran a hardware store, and where she had learned the fundamental principles of inventory and credit before she was 12. She had come west with her husband, James Covington, who had dreamed of land and open sky, and had been, by her description, a man of genuine warmth and impractical optimism, who had loved her thoroughly, and had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1878 before he had seen his dream fully realized. She had stayed because leaving felt like failing something she had committed to, and because she had already begun building the store, and because, though she did not say this in exactly those words, she had discovered that grief was easier to carry when you had something that required your full attention. She did not want sympathy, and he did not offer it. He simply listened, and when he did speak, he spoke plainly, and she seemed to appreciate both things. He told her less about himself in those early weeks, not from evasion but from a habitual economy with personal information that had developed over decades of being, professionally, a person people told things to. He was the one who listened. He was the one who absorbed and assessed and acted. He was not practiced at being the subject of attention. When she asked him questions, he noticed a slight hesitation in himself that was unfamiliar and somewhat uncomfortable. "You are not used to people being interested in you specifically," she said one afternoon, late in May, when the light was coming through the store windows at the long golden angle that meant the day was finishing, "as opposed to what you can do for them." He was quiet for long enough that the silence itself became an answer. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" she asked. 30 years, more or less," he said. "Since I was about your son's age." He had met her son by this point, a 14-year-old named Samuel who worked in the store on Saturdays and regarded Peter with the wary reverence that boys of that age sometimes had for men who carried firearms professionally. Samuel was a serious boy, dark like his mother, and clearly the center of her daily life in the way that children are for parents who are raising them without a partner. "And in 30 years, she said, people have always needed you for something. That is generally the arrangement," he said. "But has anyone," she said, and the directness with which she sometimes asked a thing was always slightly startling, like stepping on a stair that was an inch lower than expected, "has anyone simply wanted your company, not for what you could do or fix or resolve, just you, sitting in a room?" The question settled on him with a weight that surprised him. He turned it over honestly, the way she seemed to require honesty, not because she demanded it but because she herself was so consistently honest that anything less felt like an indecency in comparison. "No," he said at last, "I do not believe so." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside on the street, a wagon passed and the sound of it was briefly loud and then gone. The store was quiet and the late light made everything in it warm. "I need nothing from you, Peter," she said. She had begun using his first name perhaps 2 weeks prior, and he had adjusted to it more slowly than he expected. "Not protection or provision or any kind of rescuing. I am entirely capable and I intend to remain so." She met his eyes with the full force of that gray steadiness. "But I find that I want your company, which is a different thing entirely." He held very still, the way he sometimes held still when something significant was happening, and he needed to make absolutely certain he understood it correctly. "I want yours as well," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was two people sitting at a counter in a dry goods store in the fading afternoon, saying plain true things to each other. And perhaps that was why it felt, to Peter Hawkins, like the most significant conversation he had had in 44 years of living. He had a job in June, a brief one, a matter of tracking a man who had absconded from a business arrangement in a town 2 days' ride east. He returned to Caldwell with the feeling, new and strange, of returning to somewhere rather than simply arriving somewhere. He went directly to the store, which was still open, and came in with the trail dust still on him and set a brown paper package on the counter without ceremony. "Coffee from the Trading Post in Pratt," he said. "They source from a different supplier. I thought you might want to consider adding it." She opened the package and smelled it with the evaluative attention she gave to all merchandise, and then looked up at him. "How was the ride?" "Long," he said. "Dusty, successful. Are you hungry?" "Considerably." "I close in 20 minutes," she said. "There is a pot of stew at my house that will not eat itself." He had not been to her house before, a small but well-kept structure 3 streets back from the main road, with a kitchen garden that was already producing early vegetables and a porch that faced west to catch the evening light. Samuel was doing schoolwork at the kitchen table and acknowledged Peter with a nod that was more welcoming than his earlier wariness had been. And Peter sat at a kitchen table in a house that smelled of wood smoke and herbs and something savory. And Nora put a bowl in front of him without fanfare. And he ate, and they talked. And when the stew was gone, she made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the last of the evening light and said nothing for a long while. And the silence was the most comfortable silence Peter had occupied in as long as he could clearly remember. He rode back to the hotel late, and he lay in the small room looking at the ceiling, and he recognized, with the honest clarity of a man who made his living reading situations accurately, that he was falling in love with Nora Covington. He also recognized, with equal clarity, that he had no practical framework for what to do about this, because being necessary to people was something he understood thoroughly, but being wanted by someone who needed nothing from him was entirely uncharted ground. He was at the store the following morning with lumber. She was unlocking the front door when he arrived, and she looked at the lumber and then at him. "What is that for?" "The porch board on your back step," he said. "The second one is rotted through. You are going to put a foot through it within the week." She had not mentioned the porch board. He had noticed it himself the previous evening. "I have a list of 3 other tradesmen in this town," she said, not unkindly. "I know," he said. "I have nothing else to do this morning, and the lumber was not expensive. If you would prefer I take it to someone else and have them send you a bill, I will do that." She looked at him for a long moment, a look he was beginning to understand contained the full machinery of her assessment. Then she stepped back from the door. "The back step is around the side," she said. "I will leave the store unlocked." He fixed the back step. He also, since he was there and had the tools and because the thing bothered him, straightened a fence rail along the kitchen garden that had been leaning at an angle that would cause it to fall in the next good wind. He did not mention the fence rail. He put the tools in his saddlebag and was back on the street before she had her first customer. She found out about the fence rail that evening because Samuel mentioned it, and the next morning she was at the hotel when he came down to breakfast, sitting in the dining room with 2 cups of coffee, which was a thing she had never done before. "You fixed the fence," she said. "It was going to fall," he said, sitting down. "Peter," she said, and the way she said his name had a particular quality to it that he had not heard before, a kind of careful tenderness that made him pay close attention. "I want to say something and I want you to hear it properly." "I am listening," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "I mean I understand what you have been, how you have moved through the world. A man who is useful, a man who solves things. A man that people send for when they need something handled and then do not particularly think about when the thing is handled." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I do not want you to fix things for me because you think that is the only way you are allowed to be here. You are allowed to simply be here. The porch step, yes, that was kind and I am grateful. But if you had come in yesterday morning with nothing in your hands, nothing to offer, no reason except that you wanted to see me, that would have been welcome too. More than welcome." He was quiet. Outside the hotel window, Caldwell was waking up, wagons moving, voices calling across the distance, the whole ordinary machinery of a morning in a frontier town proceeding without reference to the 2 of them. "I am not certain I know how to do that," he said. It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to another person in years, arriving without something to offer. "I have been doing this for so long that I am not sure I know what I am without it." "Then let us find out," she said, "together. You start by finishing this coffee. Then if you like you can walk with me to the store. That is all, just walk beside me." He picked up the coffee cup. He drank. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, still soft, and Nora Covington across the table was looking at him with those careful gray eyes and something in them that was warmer than careful, something that pulled at a place in him he had spent many years leaving unattended. "All right," he said. They walked to the store. He did not carry anything. He did not fix anything. He walked beside her on the boardwalk in the morning, and when she unlocked the door and turned to thank him for his company, he said he would see her at noon, and she said yes, and he walked back through the town feeling oddly light, as though he had put down something heavy and not yet registered that his hands were empty. July came with the full force that July brings to the southern Kansas plains, a heat that was not merely warm but present, pressing against every surface with insistent authority. The cattle trade was at its peak and Caldwell was at its most crowded and its most difficult, the streets loud with drovers and traders, and the particular friction of a town, absorbing more energy than it was designed to contain. Peter had taken 2 more short jobs during the early weeks of the month, neither of them complex. A dispute over a surveyed boundary line that required him to locate a recorded deed, and a matter of escorting a payroll shipment to a ranch 20 miles west. Both were finished quickly, and both returned him to Caldwell before the week was out. Samuel Covington had begun regarding him with something approaching friendliness by this point, which Peter had not sought and found touching. The boy was 14 and fatherless, and he navigated that combination with a dignity that his mother clearly recognized and deliberately did not comment on. Peter did not try to be anything to him except a consistent, predictable presence, a man who showed up when he said he would and did not make promises he did not keep. Samuel asked him once with the directness of adolescence whether he had ever shot anyone. "Yes," Peter said, "I have had to." "Did it bother you?" "Every time," Peter said. Samuel considered this. "My mother says most men who do violence say it does not bother them." "Your mother is right," Peter said, "and she has a habit of being right about things." Samuel almost smiled. "She knows that too," he said. There was a night in mid-July when a fight broke out in the saloon nearest the hotel, the kind that spilled into the street and involved enough participants to constitute a small riot, and Marshal Greer was on the far end of town dealing with a separate incident. Peter was coming out of the hotel when the trouble reached the street, and he waded into it not because anyone had hired him, and not because it was his professional obligation, but simply because 3 men were kicking a fourth on the ground, and that was something he could not walk past. He separated the principals with more efficiency than ceremony, held 2 of them until Greer's deputy arrived, and came away from it with a split eyebrow that bled impressively and was less serious than it looked. He went to the hotel washroom and dealt with it as he always dealt with minor injuries, efficiently and without particular concern. He was there when he heard the knock at his hotel room door. It was Nora. She had a cloth and a bowl of clean water, and her face was composed, but her eyes were not entirely calm. "Samuel saw from the window," she said. "He came and told me." "It is not serious," he said. "I know it is not serious," she said. "Sit down." He sat on the edge of the bed. She stood in front of him and cleaned the cut above his eye with a concentration and gentleness that made his chest tight in a way that was entirely distinct from anything physical. "You did not have to do that tonight," she said, working carefully. "You were not deputized, you were not hired." "No," he said, "I was not. You did it because it was right." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, folding a clean part of the cloth. "I am glad you did it," she said. "And I am also," she added, softer, "glad you are not more hurt." He looked up at her, close enough now to read the thing in her face that she kept carefully banked, the feeling that lived beneath the composure and directness and the thorough self-sufficiency. "Nora," he said. "Do not move," she said. "I am not finished." He did not move. She finished cleaning the cut and applied a compress, and when she was satisfied she stepped back and looked at him with her hands folded in front of her with a composure that was perhaps 6% more effortful than her usual. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. He stood and they were close because the room was small and she had been standing near him and neither of them stepped back. The lamplight in the room was very warm and the street outside was quieting now, the trouble resolved, the town returning to itself. "I should go," she said, but she did not move. "You should," he agreed, and did not move either. He reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so gentle and so unlike anything in his professional vocabulary that it surprised even him. Her eyes closed briefly. When they opened, the gray was darker. "Peter," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what you need and do not need. I know you are not asking to be rescued. I know everything you told me about yourself is true, and I believe all of it." He searched for the right words with the same methodical care he brought to everything and found them. "I am not here because you need me. I am here because being near you is the first time in 30 years that I have not been waiting for the next problem to solve. You make the day feel like enough." She was still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You are the first person who has sat in my store and talked to me like I am interesting rather than capable. Most people see the capability and stop there. You are both," he said. Comprehensively. She laughed, a small, real laugh that transformed her face into something even more beautiful, and then she rose up on her toes and kissed him briefly on the corner of his jaw, just below the bruise that was already forming there. "Good night, Peter," she said, and took the cloth and the bowl and went. He sat back down on the edge of the bed and pressed 2 fingers to the spot on his jaw where her lips had been, and sat there for a while in the warm lamplight feeling something he had no word for, except that it was the opposite of the particular emptiness he had been carrying for 30 years. August in Caldwell brought a significant development that neither Peter nor Nora had anticipated, in the form of a man named Dale Whitmore, who arrived from St. Louis with a letter of introduction to the town council and a proposal to buy up property on the main street for the construction of a larger commercial establishment that would, by his own description, modernize the town's retail infrastructure. Whitmore was slick-haired, well-dressed by St. Louis standards, and carried with him the particular confidence of a man who had made his money in ways that remained vague under examination. He visited every business on the main street and made offers, and most of the business owners, who were essentially small operations running on thin margins, listened with the mixture of temptation and unease that an offer of easy money always creates. He came to Covington's dry goods on a Wednesday. Peter was not there. He found Nora at the counter and presented his proposal with the practiced smoothness of a man who had made it many times before. He offered her a price for the building and the business that was, she later told Peter, actually fair by current land values, which made it more complicated than if it had been insulting. Peter heard about it that evening when he came to supper and found Nora at the kitchen table with the papers Whitmore had left spread in front of her, doing arithmetic in her ledger. He sat across from her and looked at the papers. "What do you think?" he asked, because that was always the right first question with Nora. "I think the price is reasonable," she said, not looking up from the figures. "I also think that if I sell, there is no Covingtons. He will absorb the inventory and rename it and operate it differently. And the ranchers and homesteaders who depend on me for credit during lean times will have nowhere to go, because a man from St. Louis who is here to turn a profit will not extend the kind of credit that I extend." "That is almost certainly true," Peter said. "And I think," she said, finally setting down the pen, "that I am not ready to sell something I built from nothing to someone who sees it as one property in a larger acquisition. It is not about the money." She looked at him. "Is that irrational?" "It is entirely rational," he said. "It just has a cost." "I know what the cost is," she said. "I have been calculating it for 2 hours." She closed the ledger. "What I want to know is whether there is anything I should know about Whitmore before I make a decision. You read people for a living." He was quiet for a moment, processing what he had observed. "I spoke to him briefly at the hotel this afternoon," he said. "I did not like the way he talked about the existing businesses. He called them legacy operations, which is a polite way of calling something outdated. He was dismissive about the people who depend on those businesses as customers, referring to them as the current limited market, suggesting there was a better class of customer to be developed. That suggests his plans are not to serve the existing community but to replace it. He paused. That is my assessment. That matches mine, she said. I am going to decline. Then decline, he said. You know your business and your community better than he does. She nodded once decisively and put the papers aside with the finality of a matter resolved, and asked him how he wanted his coffee. He watched her move around the kitchen with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own life, and felt something in him settle further into a certainty that had been building slowly all summer. He was not leaving Caldwell. That was not a decision he had consciously made so much as a fact he had noticed. The way you notice, at some point during a long journey, that you have stopped watching for the destination and started watching the land around you. Nora declined Whitmore's offer the following morning. Whitmore, whose smoothness was thin over something less pleasant, suggested that she was making an emotional decision, which she received with the expression of a woman who had heard that particular observation before and found it tedious. I am making an informed business decision, she said. Those are not the same thing, and I would appreciate your acknowledging the difference. Whitmore left shortly after, and the matter might have ended there if Peter had not, the following week, been approached by Aldous Brightwell, who had heard a thing or two about Whitmore from a contact in St. Louis, things that had to do with a series of land acquisitions in Missouri that had been conducted through methods that were legally gray and socially darker. He passed this information to Marshal Greer, who passed it to the appropriate territorial authorities, and Whitmore departed Caldwell by the end of the month under circumstances that were not exactly voluntary. Nora heard about this from Greer, not from Peter. She came to find him at the hotel with a look on her face that was not quite gratitude and not quite something else. You passed information about Whitmore, she said. I passed accurate information about a man with a concerning history to the appropriate authority, he said. That is not exactly secret. I did not ask you to do that, she said. No, he said. You did not. He met her eyes steadily. It had nothing to do with protecting your business specifically. It had to do with him planning to operate in a community I am part of, and me having information relevant to that. The appropriate person to have that information was Greer. She was quiet for a moment. Then the not-quite look on her face resolved itself into something warmer. You said a community you are part of, she said. I did, he said. Are you, she asked, part of this community? Are you staying, Peter? He had not said it out loud before, had not formalized it even to himself, but the thing that had been a quiet, settled fact for weeks now required, apparently, to be spoken. I am, he said, if that is acceptable to you. She looked at him with the full force of those gray eyes, with everything she kept carefully measured and everything she occasionally, deliberately let through. More than acceptable, she said. He had asked her on a Sunday morning in September whether she would like to ride with him. He had 2 horses, Chester and a rented mare, and the morning was exactly the kind of September morning that the Kansas plains occasionally produce as though in apology for July, clear and cool, with a sky of absolute blue and the grass beginning its autumn color. She had looked at him across the store counter with the slight smile she reserved for things she found genuinely appealing, and said yes. They rode south, away from the town, into the open country where the land rolled and the grass moved in long, slow waves, and the only sounds were wind and hooves and the distant occasional cry of a hawk. He did not take her anywhere in particular. He just rode beside her, and they talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and the quiet was as comfortable as the talking, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had formally posed. She was a good rider, better than he had expected, though he was not certain why he had expected anything other. She sat straight and moved easily with the horse, and was completely at ease in the open country, and he found himself watching her with the slightly helpless attention of a man who has spent a great deal of effort being objective and is discovering the limits of that effort. They stopped at a creek, watered the horses, and sat on a flat limestone outcrop in the autumn sun with the water running cold and clear over the stones below them, and the town entirely invisible behind the distance and the gentle hills. "I used to dream about this kind of landscape when I was in Missouri," she said. "The openness. I did not know what to do with it at first when I got here. All that sky. It felt threatening. And now I cannot imagine being without it," she said. She turned to look at him, and the light was very direct and warm on her face, and she was, he thought, one of the most complete people he had ever encountered, a woman who had been broken open by loss and had built herself back not as she had been before, but as something stronger and more intentional. "What about you? Is there landscape you dream about?" He thought about it honestly, the way she always seemed to require. "I have been in enough places that I do not dream about particular ones," he said. "I dream about belonging to one. That is different." She was quiet, turning the question of this over the way she turned things over, thoroughly and without rush. "You have never had that," she said. "It was not a question." "No," he said. "Then," she said very carefully, "it seems to me that you might be overdue." The September afternoon sat around them, warm and golden and completely still except for the water and the wind. And Peter Hawkins, who had spent 30 years moving between other people's urgencies and crises, looked at Nora Covington and thought that the whole of that long, useful life had perhaps been a road that led here, to this limestone rock above this Kansas creek, with this particular woman looking at him with those careful eyes that were, right now, not careful at all. He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her palm and held his back, and they sat like that for a long time while the afternoon moved toward evening, and the horses grazed in the grass below them, and the sky began to go the colors it goes when the sun is dropping toward the horizon of a flat and open land. He proposed in October, on the porch of her house on an evening when the first real cold of autumn had arrived, and they were sitting with blankets, and the smell of wood smoke coming from inside, and the stars beginning to appear with the extra clarity that cold nights give them. He had thought about how to do it and had concluded that anything theatrical or elaborate would be precisely wrong, so he simply said, "I would like to marry you, Nora, if you will have me." She was quiet for long enough that he felt the particular vulnerability of a man who has said a true thing and must now wait for another person's truth in return. "I want to be honest with you about what I am offering and what I am not," she said. "Please," he said. "I will not give up the store," she said. "It is mine and I worked for it, and it matters to me and to this community." "I know," he said. "I will not change how I manage my own affairs simply because there is a husband in the house." "I would not want you to," he said. "I fell in love with a woman who manages her own affairs. Removing that would be removing what I love." She turned to look at him in the darkness of the porch. "You fell in love with me," she said, as though hearing this stated plainly required a moment. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since some time in June, possibly late May. I am not entirely certain of the exact moment." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I fell in love with you approximately the third Tuesday you brought lunch. You described the way the light changes on the plains before a storm, and I thought, this man notices things. Not the way people who are observant for professional purposes notice things. He notices things because he finds the world genuinely interesting. That was when he absorbed this." "You have known since late April," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you told me in October." "I was making certain," she said with a trace of the half-smile. "I am thorough." He laughed, a full real laugh that surprised him with how easy it felt. "Nora Covington," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her then, properly, the way he had not yet kissed her despite the weeks and months of lunches and suppers and evenings, and that September afternoon on the limestone rock, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a certainty that were entirely characteristic, and the cold autumn night around them was entirely irrelevant. Samuel, when informed the following morning, was quiet for a moment in the way that a 14-year-old boy is quiet when he is processing a large thing, and then said, "Will you teach me to track?" "If you would like," Peter said. Samuel extended his hand. "All right then," he said, which was apparently the extent of his response to the news that his mother was getting married, and which Peter found, on reflection, completely sufficient. They were married in November, in the church on the far side of town, on a Saturday morning with the cottonwood trees along the main street bare, and the sky the deep cold blue of late autumn. Nora wore a dress the color of slate, because white was impractical, and she was, as she had said to the dressmaker who suggested otherwise, not a woman of impractical impulses. She was breathtakingly beautiful in it, or at least Peter found her so, standing at the front of the church with her hands folded and her chin up and her gray eyes on him as he came down the aisle beside Aldous Brightwell, who had agreed to stand with him. He had no family present. He had not had close family for many years, his mother long gone, his father gone before her, a sister in Illinois with whom he exchanged letters at Christmas, but from whom he was essentially estranged by years of different lives. Nora had her sister, Margaret, who had come up from Missouri for the wedding and who was warm and somewhat overwhelming in the way of certain generous people, and who embraced Peter immediately upon meeting him and said, "She needs someone who is not frightened of her," which he found both accurate and amusing. The minister was brief, and the reception was at the hotel, which was the largest available space, and the people who came were the people of Caldwell. Brightwell and his wife, Marshall Greer, the school teacher who had taught Samuel, the doctor whose hands no longer shook since someone had had a frank conversation with him about his habits, the banker, the blacksmith, the ranching families within riding distance, the people whose accounts Nora kept and whose children she sometimes helped with reading on winter afternoons when the store was slow. It was a community, Peter saw, looking around the room. A real one, with its complications and its histories and its genuine fondnesses. And Nora was the center of a significant portion of its connective tissue. He had spent 30 years being a service. He was now, apparently, a husband. He was not entirely certain how to be a husband, but he thought the approach was probably similar to the approach required by everything else. Pay attention, be honest, show up. He showed up. He found, surprisingly and somewhat to his own bemusement, that the showing up was not difficult. He had been afraid in the months before the wedding that permanence would feel confining, that the man who had always kept his saddlebag half-packed would chafe against a life with a specific address. He did not. He settled into the house the way water settles into ground after rain, finding the low places, filling them naturally. He put his clothes in the wardrobe beside hers. He learned where things were kept and where they were supposed to be returned. He learned the rhythm of the household, which ran on Nora's efficient schedule and which had no wasted motion and which, he found, had room for him within it. He kept some work. Not the dangerous or prolonged varieties, but the local and occasional, helping Greer with situations that required particular skills, doing some survey work for a new ranching family that arrived in the spring, maintaining a kind of unofficial advisory capacity that several of the businesses and ranchers found useful. He brought money into the household, but not as much as Nora did, which seemed to him entirely proper. The store was hers and its income was hers, and what he brought was supplementary, and if any man in Caldwell had an opinion about this arrangement, Peter had not heard it expressed where he could respond to it, which was probably wise of them. Samuel, in the winter after the wedding, began riding with him on weekend mornings, learning the tracking work that Peter had promised to teach him. He was a quick study, the boy, with his mother's attention and his own particular patience for sitting still and watching, which was the hardest skill to teach, and the one Samuel seemed to have naturally. They talked on those rides in the way that two people talk when they are doing something together with their hands and eyes engaged, obliquely, in pieces, honestly. "Do you miss being on your own?" Samuel asked him once, on a cold February morning with the ground hard under the horses' hooves and their breath making clouds. Peter considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said. "I was on my own for a long time and I thought I was accustomed to it. I was not. I was just used to it. Those are different." Samuel rode beside him for a while without speaking. Then, "My father was happy, I think. He was not very practical, my mother says, but he was happy." "Being happy is a significant accomplishment," Peter said, "more than people give it credit for." "Are you happy?" Samuel asked. Peter looked at the open country around them, the winter-pale grass and the absolute silence of the plains in cold morning air, and thought of the house 3 streets back from the main road and the woman in it who had said, "I want your company," which was not the same as "I need you" and was worth more. "Yes," he said, "I am." Samuel nodded once as if this confirmed something, and they rode on. Spring arrived in the particular sudden way it arrives on the Kansas plains, as though someone has simply decided winter is finished and turned everything green overnight. The store had its busiest season as new settlers arrived and established families restocked after winter, and Nora moved through the increased demand with the efficient pleasure of someone who loves their work and is good at it. And Peter found himself, on quiet afternoons, simply sitting in the store not doing anything particular except being present while she worked. She had said he was allowed to simply be there. He was learning it. The first few times he sat in the back room of the store reading while she ran the counter, he had felt the residual pull of usefulness, the sense that he ought to be doing something productive. Over time, the pull eased. He was there. She was there. The store bell rang and customers came and went, and she managed it all with her characteristic competence. And occasionally she looked back through the doorway to where he sat, and the look was not a look that required anything. It was simply, "There you are," and he looked back, and that was sufficient. He had not understood before Nora how much of what he had taken for independence had actually been loneliness wearing the clothes of self-sufficiency. He had moved from one necessary task to the next for 30 years, and told himself that the movement was freedom, and the utility was purpose, and both of those things had been partially true and entirely incomplete. In April, Nora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening in the kitchen, with Samuel already in bed and the house quiet, and she said it with her characteristic directness while he was washing the supper dishes, which she had decided was his contribution to the household maintenance. She simply said, "I believe I am pregnant." He turned from the basin and looked at her, and she was watching him with that careful measuring look that she used when something mattered, and she needed to assess the situation honestly. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and said nothing for a moment because there were no words that were as large as what he was feeling. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I saw the doctor this morning. He confirmed it. He says July, possibly August." "Are you glad?" he asked. The careful look softened entirely, and the warmth that sometimes broke through her composure was present now in full and unguarded form. "I am very glad," she said. "Are you?" "I did not think," he said slowly, finding his way through this new territory, "that this was a thing that was going to happen in my life. I had made a certain amount of peace with that." "And now?" she asked. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, and her hands turned in his to hold his instead, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and entirely perfect. "And now I am the most glad I have ever been," he said. Samuel took the news with characteristic economy. He said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" And when Peter said they would not know until it arrived, Samuel said, "I suppose either is acceptable," and returned to his schoolwork. Nora had the baby in August as the doctor had predicted, and it was a boy, which Peter had not dared to hope for specifically and had hoped for specifically. They named him James, for Nora's first husband, which was Peter's suggestion, offered carefully and received by Nora with the kind of emotion she rarely allowed herself to show fully, a brightness in the gray eyes and a silence that contained a great deal. "You are certain," she said. "He was a good man and Samuel's father," Peter said. "There is room for that in this house." She held his face in both hands and kissed him with a tenderness that went somewhere deep in him, and that was the end of that conversation. James Peter Hawkins, by the time he was 2 months old, had the full devoted attention of his older brother Samuel, who had decided, somewhat to everyone's surprise, that he was deeply interested in babies and held James with a careful concentration that made Nora laugh helplessly whenever she watched them. Peter sat in the rocking chair on the porch in the evenings with James on his chest, the warm, slight weight of the sleeping infant, and looked out at the street and the evening sky, and felt the particular stillness that this specific combination of circumstances seemed to produce in him. A man who had been in motion for 30 years finding that stillness was not the same as stagnation, that being stopped was not the same as being stuck. The town itself was growing, as towns grew in those years. The railroad was coming closer, which everyone knew because it transformed everything it reached. New families arrived with the spring and found establishments, and put down roots with the speed that frontier people sometimes moved, necessity accelerating what would elsewhere take decades. Covington's dry goods expanded in 1883, adding a second room for dry goods overflow, and a small section of hardware that Nora had identified as an unmet need in the community. Peter helped build the addition, along with the blacksmith and a carpenter who had settled the previous fall, and when it was done and stocked and looking exactly as functional and well-kept as everything Nora touched, she stood in the middle of it and put her hands on her hips and looked around with the expression of a person surveying completed work with honest satisfaction. "Good?" he asked. "Very good," she said. He kissed her right there in the new addition with sawdust still on the floor, and it was not the graceful action of a man who had rehearsed such things. It was simply the spontaneous response of a man who was deeply in love with his wife, and found himself frequently unable to be in the same room with her without wanting to demonstrate this in some way. She kissed him back with equal spontaneity, and the store was closed anyway because it was Sunday, and they had privacy for once because Samuel had taken James to visit Brightwell's ranch to see the new foal that had arrived that week. So they had the building to themselves for one of the very few uninterrupted afternoons of a life that was full and complicated and entirely wonderful. There was trouble in the late fall of 1883, though it was not the kind of trouble that Peter's particular skills were most directly suited to. It was the trouble that came when a homesteading family south of town, the Delaney's, lost their eldest son to a fever and then their remaining savings to a crop failure, and faced the winter without enough of either. The community knew about it, as communities do, and various people brought various things, but it was not until Nora simply opened an account for them at the store with a credit line that was twice what she offered any established customer that the situation stabilized, and even then the winter was hard for them. Peter took Samuel out to the Delaney place twice that winter to help with maintenance that had been deferred, fencing and firewood, and the two of them worked alongside Thomas Delaney, a man of about 60 who had the particular dignity of someone who has been struck down and is trying to regain his footing without humiliation. Peter worked beside him without comment on the necessity of the help, treating it simply as neighborly activity, which it was, and Thomas Delaney gripped his hand at the end of the second day with the kind of grip that contained things that were not being said and which both of them understood. He told Nora about it that evening and she listened and then said, "You know he will pay back every cent when he is able." "I know," Peter said. "That is why I gave him the credit," she said, "because people who have that kind of pride pay their debts. It is the people who have no pride who are the risk." She was nursing James, who was 4 months old and currently expressing strong opinions about something, and she looked up at Peter over the top of the baby's head with a look that was entirely fond. "You are a good man, Peter Hawkins." "I am learning to be," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You are, you have been. You did not know it because no one was watching you be it for yourself." They were only watching you be it for them. He sat with that for a while. The kitchen was warm. The fire was good. James had settled and was making the small, satisfied sounds of an infant recently fed. Samuel was in his room reading, and the house was full of the ordinary comforting noise of people living their lives under one roof. He thought about the man who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1882 with a worn saddlebag and a bone-deep exhaustion, and a life that consisted of moving from one other person's urgency to the next, useful and professional and almost entirely without a self that existed outside of what he could do. He was not certain, on honest reflection, that he had understood himself to be a complete person apart from his utility, and he was also not certain that that man would have been capable of sitting in a warm kitchen in the winter of 1883, accepting a compliment from his wife without immediately deflecting it toward what else still needed to be done. He received it. He let it settle in the place where honest words live. He said, "Thank you," and meant it the way it is rare to mean a simple thing. December brought Christmas, which Nora approached with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything, decorating the house with a restrained elegance that reflected her preference for quality over quantity, preparing food with the help of Margaret, who had come up from Missouri for the holiday, and who filled the house with a cheerful volume that was the opposite of her sister's contained nature, and which James found absolutely fascinating, staring at Margaret with enormous round eyes whenever she spoke. Samuel received new boots and a copy of a recent geography text he had asked for, and Peter gave Nora a garnet brooch that he had ordered 3 months prior from a jeweler in Wichita, a thing of restrained beauty that seemed to him to match her exactly, and she pinned it to her dress that same evening and wore it with the quiet pleasure of someone receiving a gift that was genuinely considered. She gave him a journal, hand-bound in brown leather. "You have been everywhere," she said. "You should have a record of it." He had never kept a journal. The idea of it, of turning inward and rendering his own experience on paper, had never been something he associated with himself. He turned the journal in his hands, the soft leather and the blank pages. "I do not know what to write," he said. "Start with today," she said. "That is always the right starting point." He started with today. He wrote with his careful, unpracticed hand about the kitchen and the fire and the smell of the food that Margaret and Nora had made, and about James asleep in his cradle in the corner, and about Samuel's face when he opened the boots and immediately sat down to put them on, and about the garnet brooch against the gray of Nora's dress, and about the 30 years he had spent being necessary, and the 1 year he had spent being loved, and how the latter contained more than the former had in all its entirety. He wrote, "She said she needed nothing from me except my company, and I thought I did not know how to offer that. It turns out that I had been offering it all my life. I had simply never had anyone who could receive it." Spring of 1884 came in with the warmth and certainty of a season that means what it says. James was 7 months old and had recently discovered the principle of forward locomotion, which he applied with terrifying enthusiasm to the project of reaching anything he was not supposed to reach. Samuel was 15 now, taller by 2 inches over the winter, with the beginning of the angular look of a young man replacing the softer face of the boy. And he was doing well at school and writing well and talking, occasionally, with the careful seriousness of someone beginning to think about what he wanted his life to be. He told Peter on one of their morning rides that he thought he might want to study law. "What kind of law?" Peter asked. "Property law," Samuel said. "Land rights. There are a great many people here who do not understand what they are entitled to, and a great many other people who take advantage of that." He was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about it for a while, since the Delaney situation partly, the way those homestead rights get complicated." "That is a worthwhile thing to study," Peter said. "My mother thinks so too," Samuel said. "She thinks I could go to college in a few years. There are colleges in the East now that have good law programs." "Your mother is usually right about these things," Peter said. "Yes," Samuel said, with the practiced resignation of someone who has known this all his life. "She is." Peter told Nora that evening what Samuel had said, and she listened with the expression of a woman who has already done all the planning for something but is generous enough to let other people discover it on their own schedule. "You knew," he said. "We discussed it in January," she said. "I have already written to 3 schools for information." She was feeding James, who was in his usual focused and slightly urgent relationship with mealtime. "He is going to be good at it. He has the mind for precision and the character for fairness." "He has your mind," Peter said. "He has both our minds," she said, glancing at him over James's head. "He has been watching you work for a year and a half. You think in evidence and consequence. That is a legal mind." He had not thought of himself as contributing anything to Samuel's development that would be worth naming. He absorbed this quietly. "You are not always going to be surprised when you have an effect on people," Nora said, with a slight smile. "Eventually it will become a predictable part of your experience." "You are the most direct woman I have ever met," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me that approximately 5 months ago." "I meant it as a compliment." "I received it as one," she said. "The summer of 1884 was the summer that the railroad reached Caldwell proper, which transformed everything. The trail traffic had been declining for 2 years as the Kansas legislature tightened the restrictions on Texas cattle, and the town had been adjusting to the transition from a drover's stop to a more settled agricultural and commercial center. The railroad accelerated and confirmed this transition. New businesses came with it, new families, a second doctor whose hands were entirely steady, a proper schoolhouse to replace the converted storehouse they had been using. Nora expanded the store again, this time adding a postal function on behalf of the railroad, which made Covington's the communications center of a significant portion of the county, as well as its primary dry goods supplier. She hired a young woman named Clara Finch to help full-time, which was the first time the store had had a regular employee other than Samuel, and she trained Clara with the same systematic attention to quality that she applied to everything. Peter's occasional work settled, in this more ordered town, into a specific informal arrangement with the county, a kind of special deputy role that required his skills perhaps a dozen times a year and otherwise left him free. He used the freedom to build things, to learn from the carpenter who had become a friend, to spend time with his son, who was now walking with the full, confident purposefulness of a 1-year-old, and who had developed a particular devotion to his father that Peter found simultaneously moving and slightly terrifying, given its unconditional and entirely uncritical nature. He was learning how to receive unconditional love. It was, he found, the most difficult thing he had undertaken, and also the most valuable. James at 14 months pulled himself upright using Peter's boot and stood there with enormous gravity for 3 seconds before sitting back down, looked up at Peter with complete satisfaction and said with perfect clarity, "Duh." Peter sat on the kitchen floor and looked at his son and did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes," because that was both the answer to the word and the answer to everything the word meant. Nora was in the doorway. She had seen it. She said nothing, just leaned against the doorframe with the full warmth of her smile visible in the way that her whole face was her smile when she let it be. And Peter looked at her over his son's head and felt the particular gratitude of a man who has been given the life he did not know he wanted because he did not know before he had it that wanting was allowed. There was a moment in September of 1884, on the anniversary of the proposal, that Peter thought about often afterward. They were on the porch again as they had been the year before, but the evening was warmer than that November night had been, and James was inside with Samuel, who had claimed temporary guardianship with older brother authority, and they were alone with the last of the evening light and the first stars. He had been thinking about the journal and what he had written in it over the past months, and about a question he had never quite been able to stop turning over. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always," she said. "When you said you needed nothing from me except my company," he said, "did you mean that as a comfort? that I could stop working so hard to be useful. She turned to look at him in the gathering dark, and her face was entirely readable in the way it was when she chose to make it so. "I meant it as an exact truth," she said. "I did not need your protection. I did not need your money. I did not need you to fix things or solve things or manage things. I have done all of those things for years, and I am perfectly capable of continuing to do them." She paused. "But I sat in that store alone for 4 years, and I ran it well, and I raised my son, and I managed my accounts and my community and my grief, and I was capable and self-sufficient, and entirely, without anyone who simply wanted to be in the same room as me because they found me worthwhile. Not useful, worthwhile." She looked at him steadily. "You were the first man who sat across my counter and made me feel like the most interesting thing in the room, not a resource, not a widow with an established business, not a capable woman that it would be convenient to align oneself with, just me." She touched his face, her hand warm and familiar against his jaw. "That is what I needed, just that." He turned his face into her hand for a moment, and then took it and held it between both of his. "I think," he said, "that I had been useful to people for so long that I had forgotten I was a person outside of that utility. I do not know if I would have remembered without you." "You would have," she said. "Eventually, you were always in there." "Maybe," he said, "but it is much better to have been reminded by you than to have figured it out alone at 55. She laughed, and the laugh was warm and real in the September night. "Yes," she said, "I imagine it is." The years that followed had the quality that good years have. They are less dramatic than bad years, less quotable, but they are dense with substance. Samuel grew and flourished and went east to study law at 18. Writing home, with the mixture of complaints about the cold and pride in his work that suggested he was exactly where he was supposed to be. James became a boy, and then a particular kind of boy, serious and observant like his mother, and physically capable like his father, who moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came, Peter thought, from simply having parents who were consistently themselves. Nora discovered she was expecting again in the spring of 1886, which she announced with the same directness she brought to all important information, and which Peter received with the same profound gladness that had met the first announcement. This time the child was a girl, born in October, and they named her Ruth, after Nora's mother who had died the previous winter. Ruth from her first days had the look of her father, dark-eyed and watchful, and the character of her mother, which was to say absolutely definite about what she wanted and extremely capable of communicating it. Peter held Ruth on the first day, in the doctor's house where Nora had given birth, and looked down at his daughter with the particular quality of attention that new parents have, the absolute freshness of encountering a new person who did not exist before, and felt the accumulation of everything he was, and had been, and had become resting in the small, warm weight in his arms. Nora was watching him from the bed, tired but entirely present in the way she was always entirely present, and she said, "You look like you have something to say." "I have been thinking about something," he said, not looking up from Ruth. "Tell me." "I have been trying to understand the difference," he said, "between a life that is spent and a life that is lived. I think the difference is whether you are the one choosing." He looked up at her then. "I spent 30 years making choices on other people's behalf. Good choices mostly, useful ones, but I was always at the service of someone else's need. And then I came to Caldwell and I chose to stay, not because someone hired me. Not because there was a problem to solve, because there was something here worth choosing." Nora held out her hand and he crossed the room and took it, his daughter in the crook of his other arm. "You chose me," she said. "I chose you," he said, "and you chose me, and that is the whole of it." She squeezed his hand and looked at their daughter and then at him, and the gray eyes were the warmest they ever were, which was the warmest he had ever seen anything. Caldwell continued to grow and change through the late 1880s, as Kansas worked its complicated way through the end of the open-range era, into the fenced and farmed and railroad-connected territory it was becoming. The town acquired a newspaper, then a second bank, then a community hall that was used for dances and meetings and theatrical presentations of variable quality. Peter was appointed county assessor in 1887, a position that suited his particular combination of skills and his reputation for scrupulous fairness, and which allowed him to continue contributing to the community in the way that was natural to him, without requiring him to be primarily a man of violence, which he had always found the least interesting part of his professional life. He was 50 now, and there was more silver in his hair than dark, and his face had settled into the lines of a man who has been outdoors for a lifetime, and who has smiled, in recent years, considerably more than he had in the preceding ones. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but he was, people said, a man you trusted on sight, which he thought was a more useful thing. Nora, at 44, ran the best business in Caldwell by most measures, had served on the town council for 2 years, had trained 3 young women who had gone on to operate their own businesses in neighboring towns, and remained the most rigorous and interesting person he had ever known. She had also, he had observed over 6 years of marriage, a side to her that she showed only to him and occasionally to their children, a playfulness and a wry delight in the absurdities of life that her professional composure did not betray, and which he considered among the great privileges of his existence to be the primary recipient of. They were, by all the evidence, happy. Not the fictional happiness of stories where everything is resolved and nothing is difficult, but the actual happiness of people who have built something real together, and who know the value of it because they remember what it cost. James, at 6, was being educated at the new school and reading with a speed that alarmed his teacher and delighted Nora, who quietly supplied the school with additional books from the store on a semi-regular basis. Ruth, at 2, was in the process of conducting a systematic investigation of every cupboard and corner of the house that was not specifically locked, and had formed a close working relationship with the elderly hound dog who had arrived at their door the previous spring and simply declined to leave. Samuel came home from school in the summer of 1888, taller and more angular and clearly someone who had been sharpened by education into something precise and purposeful. He spent 3 weeks at home, and they were, Peter thought, among the better weeks of recent memory, the household full and loud in the way it was only when everyone was there. Samuel and James occupying opposite sides of a running debate about something they could not agree on, Ruth systematically redistributing household objects for reasons that remained unclear, Nora cooking larger quantities of everything with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who likes feeding people, and Peter moving through all of it with the awareness of a man who knows exactly what he has. On the last evening of Samuel's visit, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, the 3 of them, Peter, Nora, and Samuel, sat on the porch in the summer night with the kind of ease that long familiarity and genuine mutual regard produce. "Are you glad?" Samuel asked, and the question was directed at Peter. It was the same question he had asked on that cold February morning 6 years ago. Peter looked at him across the dark porch, this young man who had offered him a handshake and a question about tracking and had been, without ever making anything of it, one of the people who had made this life possible. "Every day," Peter said, "without reservation, every single day." Samuel nodded, satisfied, and leaned back in his chair and looked at the stars. Nora reached over and took Peter's hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, without looking at him, without making anything of it, simply because they were beside each other, and the night was warm and she wanted to. He held her hand and looked at the stars over Kansas, and thought about the man who had ridden into town 6 years ago with a worn saddlebag and an exhaustion that was 30 years deep, who had crossed a street to buy ammunition and found, in a white clapboard store with a well-kept display window, a woman who did not need anything from him and wanted everything that he was. He thought about what he had written in the journal on that first Christmas, and about everything he had written since, and about how the pages that had been blank were full now, not with heroics or crises or the dramatic machinery of the life he had lived before, but with ordinary, extraordinary things. The smell of bread in the morning, the sound of children in a house, the particular quality of the light on the plains before a storm, the way his wife laughed when something genuinely surprised her, the weight of a sleeping infant on his chest, the satisfaction of sitting in a warm room in winter with nowhere to be and no problem to solve, and the full knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had been necessary for 30 years, and it had been enough to keep him moving but never enough to make him whole. He had been wanted for 6 years, wanted not for what he could provide or fix or resolve, but simply for the fact of himself, his company and his conversation and his presence in the particular place where he happened to be, and it had made him something he had not been before, a man who was not merely useful but fully alive. Nora turned her head and looked at him in the warm dark, and her gray eyes in the starlight were entirely clear. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned to look at her, his wife, the woman who had said, "I need nothing from you except your company," and had meant it in the most generous and exacting way, the woman who had returned him to himself with the simple act of seeing him accurately. "I am thinking," he said, "that this is what 30 years of travel was for, getting here." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she smiled, the full real smile that she kept for him, that transformed her careful face into something bright and completely open. "Yes," she said, "I rather think it was." The stars moved above Kansas in the slow turning of the summer night, and the house behind them held their sleeping children, and the town beyond the porch was quiet and alive and continuing, and Peter Hawkins sat beside the woman he loved in the fullness of a life that fit him perfectly and was content, completely and without remainder, in a way that he had not known a man could be. He was not necessary anymore. He was wanted. And the difference between those two things was the whole world.